Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Cloud Architects Podcast. My name's Chris Goosen, and as always, I'm joined by Nicholas Blank.
Hello.
And today we have a really exciting guest. We're super excited to talk about this topic, and with this guest in particular, Donovan Stevens. Say hello.
Hey guys, good morning from the US. Nice to see you. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for joining us. And actually, we're in the same city. So had it not been for pandemic, we probably could have been in the same room recording this. But sadly, we've had to adapt and move on, I guess, just like everyone else in the world, right?
Yeah.
So not joined by Warren today. So if those Warren fans, sorry guys, Warren's a little out of sorts, but he'll be with us next time. What's been going on? It's been a while. It's been I probably 3 months since I've recorded something. I know you guys did a show with Anna, which I remember the day that show came out. I was driving to the office and I listened to it in the car, and I thought, you guys have just basically talked about my life at the moment, right? So for those folks who haven't kind of gotten to episode 48, digital fatigue, it's a real thing, man. And I tell you what, I think it's just getting, at least for me personally, it's getting worse, like not being able to do anything. It's really cold here in the US now, so I'm not even outside as much as I would, even in my own yard as I would be. It's meeting fatigue it's becoming a problem. But hey, excited to be talking again. What's been going on with you?
I've been fixing customers, and this is kind of like a little mini segue in terms of what we're going to talk to Donovan about. But the amount of exposure and the amount of risk that's out there with COVID is just ridiculous. It's like the same people who would be attacking us now have got less to do and have got more time to be attacking us. And we had customers taken for ridiculous amounts of money because of really basic things, like ridiculously basic, to the point where one of our customers moved to cloud because they had to in a hurry. It's Corona, so everybody go to cloud. Teams, yay! And Teams is wonderful, except it's not wonderful when identity isn't nailed down. And they didn't even have MFA in place. So I don't want to talk about the kill chain yet. I think we'll get there later on in the show. But the kill chain was really simple, and an invoice was generated that went to a department that got paid for a ridiculous amount of money. And this story just rinsed and repeated. We got incident calls. We asked, where you at? Oh, we're in the cloud. We should be safe. Really? And so don't want to spoil anything on this conversation. I want to respect the fact that we have got Donovan here, and we want to attack his big brain and get as much value out of it for our listeners. So that's been my last couple of months, and it's been I think December petered down nicely, then January just started with a wild sprint, and we're still sprinting, and I think the rest of the world is there.
That's been very much my kind of experience over the last few months too. And in just a mini rant here, but I still talk to customers that are like, one, they don't take the threat seriously, but two, they don't take Microsoft seriously, right? And I realize we're a little biased on the show, and I'm happy to admit that. But if you're using Office 365, you have no excuse not to use MFA, right? And so when you get customers that say, well, hey, we don't see Microsoft as a security vendor, and we haven't decided on our MFA platform yet, you're like, that's a bit of a risk right there. But anyway, I digress. I'll get off my soapbox, at least for now. So Donovan's here. We wanted to talk about this thing, right? Now, when you think about threats at the moment and threats we're facing, obviously work from home and Corona is a big thing, but we all tend to kind of gravitate, at least for me anyway, towards kind of email as an attack vector, right? But there are ways that the bad guy is harvesting and doing reconnaissance that doesn't always involve email, or at least it happens before email.
Yeah, I mean, you guys.
Sorry, guys. Before we go down this road, should we introduce Donovan?
We did.
Did we?
Well, kind of, sort of.
Well, let's
What does
do it
Donovan
again.
do?
Oh.
Yes, let's do it again. What does Donovan do? And if
Sorry,
I messed up
Donovan.
really badly, I'll just edit this out. And if it's not, then people just laughing.
Yeah. Hey, we're just having a conversation. Sorry, Donovan.
Yeah, absolutely. Should I go ahead and introduce myself, or?
Yes, please.
Please do.
Yeah, so my name is Donovan. I'm a sales engineer, or SE, for a company called SpyCloud, and we specialize in the ATO space. But part of what I do is not just working and supporting a sales team. Part of what I do is investigations. So before we talk to customers, I will do a query against our breach catalog or data lake. And at this point, we have over 31,000 breaches that we've ingested, over 110 billion records, over 90 or 100 billion plain text passwords, to see how much exposure that account that I'm going to talk to has. And it's shocking to me. It's shocking the amount of data that we have. And I showed Chris some of this a week ago when him and I chatted about this. So that's kind of high level what I do. And then I also support teams that use our backend for fraud, or criminal investigations. Big companies that have pretty mature security teams where they're constantly chasing down fraudulent activity or criminal activity. I support them in, kind of using the tools that we have, or, in some cases we use OSINT, techniques, open source intelligence techniques. Sometimes it's a combination of our data and a bit of OSINT work to find, a fraudster or a criminal online. I mentioned to Chris too, we work with law enforcement agencies, a lot of the three-letter agencies. I'll just mention the FBI as one of them. These guys, Interpol, they use our data because we're constantly ingesting new breaches. And I'll talk a little bit about our, the way that we get the breaches, which is what's separates us from your typical threat intel platform or companies that claim that they do ATO. Most of the other companies in the space typically will scrape the dark web for breach lists. Those are often stuff that's recycled, that's been around for a decade, and maybe there will be a small other list and they'll merge it and create a combo list and resell it. We're constantly in underground communities, forums, chat rooms, social engineering the bad guys basically out of new breaches, and that's kind of what we do. And then we have tools that we built on how to either ingest our data or how to automate the process of, remediating your environment. So if a user, logs into your AD and they have a password that's been seen in a breach, that we have a product that automates the process of letting them know that their credentials has been seen in a third-party breach, and then requesting that they change their password. That's kind of high level what my role is, and the company that I work for. You guys hit the nail on the head with the shift that's happened, right? ATO has been around for a long time. People have been,
And ATO stands for
account takeover. Basically breaches, right? Where a company gets their user directory credentials gets breached in some shape or form. If you think back, I mean, gosh, LinkedIn was about a decade ago, maybe even longer, where criminals got access to their user names and passwords. There's been so many other examples, but I think what's happened and why it's become a lot more visible now has been COVID. If you think about what the pandemic has done to our new normal, to our world, it's completely changed our digital world, right? The uptick of online banking, the proliferation of accounts, streaming, right, services, food delivery services, all the things that we need now in this work from home world that we live in has just super expanded the online communities, and it's essentially just created, and I think Nick, you mentioned this too, the amount of screen time that there is now has just exploded. So there's a lot more people online, there's a lot more accounts, a lot of this has happened rapidly, so people have not put in place, MFA and other, tools that make it a little more difficult for the bad guys to get into accounts because of this rush to get their content online. So it's expanded the attack surface, and it's global, and it's essentially just created this vulnerable consumer space and a playground for bad guys in the account takeover space.
There's a lot to unpack with that, right? I think most listeners would probably be familiar with Troy Hunt and the work he does with Have I Been Pwned, but essentially he's only scraping the surface, forgive the pun, right, of that, because he's pulling in all the breach data that you can go and validate your username against, but you never know whether that username was breached 10 years ago or yesterday, right? And so and I guess the reason the episode came about was I was shocked when Donovan and I had a sit down and we were looking at some of the stuff, and he said, "Well, let me query or do an investigation into you." And I'm like, "Hey, I feel like I'm fairly savvy with keeping my personal info." No,
Yeah.
I mean, I might be, but people who I provide my data to may not be as good. I mean, there was data breaches there that I didn't even know these places had been breached, right? Where they have absolutely all of my information. So it's pretty scary when you do that, and then when you're able to use, I guess, the analytics of being able to map some of these things together. It's a scary thought. But I thought, well, as consumers, we're constantly thinking about, well, I gave my data to XYZ company, and hang on, I gave my data to XYZ company. Let's not get into that. And they got breached, and so now that username, password, and personal data is out there, right? But we never really think about this in a business context, which when you shift your mind into the mind of a CISO or a security manager or someone within the security team at an organization, it doesn't matter if it's 100 user or 100,000 user org. All of a sudden, that's a lot more scary than just going, Pizza Hut lost my data. I don't know that Pizza Hut this necessarily lost my data, but I'm just as an example, right? So you kind of get kind of a little nervous about that, and then and of course then you start thinking, well, not only what is the solution, but what are all the possibilities of which this data can be used, right? And immediately in my mind, we were talking earlier about phishing attacks and email being that sort of number one entry point still. Well, if I know everything about you, doesn't it make it so much easier for me to craft an email that you're more likely to actually click on? Because it's been very much tailored around you, your background, your education, your whatever, right? Because I've been able to harvest that information just off the internet.
It happened to me today, actually. And a colleague came to me and said, I sent you a mail, or I replied to your message, or I forwarded you a message, actually, that you sent to me, my name, spelled correctly, which is interesting because my name's got a slightly unusual spelling. And my name that was spelled correctly came from some strange email address, but the display name was set correctly. It said, do this thing urgently which also recognizes the hierarchy in the company, because it was an email to one of my heads of department, and I'm the CEO. So, email from the CEO to a head of department saying, do this thing urgently. But she had the foresight to go look at the email, look at the display name, forward me the mail saying, is this thing valid? And the cool thing was, it was actually caught in a spam filter as well. And so lots of checks and balances happened there, which is great. But I'm going to suspect that this was a highly automated process that knew what the hierarchy was in a particular company and was able to harvest two sets of information, therefore craft a phishing campaign based on leaked or compromised information.
Yeah, that sounds exactly right. I saw this great tagline the other day on an article that said, "Attackers don't break into your environment; they walk in." And to Chris's point too, I'll tell you guys something else that we're collecting a lot of these days is what we call botnet data. So,
oh yeah,
essentially users that have malware on their systems. And yeah, I'm amazed when I see the amount of data that we get on a particular user. To your point, Chris, not just, address, IP address, geolocation, ethnicity, your mortgage rate, your salary range, just a religious, preference. I mean,
wow.
data that a criminal can use to spearfish you and really craft a very, very clever message. And to us in the IT communities, we've been around for decades. A lot of us, some of us use password vaults. We're security conscious. We've become security conscious. But there's a lot of people out there that are not at that level. So they become targets. And people that have malware on their systems and are not aware of it, doesn't matter if they change their password. The command and control traffic sends the new password back to home base. And we see this a lot, and we report on this a lot, and that's in our data too. And I'm just amazed at the amount of PII information that we have on some users. And here's the other thing, and I showed Chris a little bit of this. I could run a query against our data on let's say an email address, maybe a corporate email address. And I might find a couple of records, maybe username, password, or email address, password, few other attributes, maybe phone number, IP address, that kind of stuff. And then I'll take some of those attributes, like IP address, for instance, and I would go to this link analysis tool that we use called Maltego. Coincidentally was developed by a South African company. A lot of law enforcement agencies use this. We use it to pretty mature security teams use it too, and it allows you to run transforms off of certain attributes. So you can pivot from one data point and say, okay, let me pull out this IP address, and now I want to see if there are any other records in our data that has the same IP address. And I sometimes start with one email address, maybe two records that I found on an email address. And once I pivot off that IP address, I'll find 200 more. And now all of a sudden I have data on that person's kids because they're using that computer at home, the URLs that they're going to, their login credentials, addresses, and it just blows the doors wide open. In fact, I'm doing a demo later today for a customer where I'm showing them exactly that, where I found an employee where there was a couple of entries in our data, but then I pivoted off that employee's IP address and found, I think, 200 additional records, which just shows how exposed that person is, how owned they are essentially. And this is the scary part. Botnets is becoming a huge part of the criminal underworld because it's it's collecting so much more information about either a company or a user that criminals use. So that's something that's become more and more prevalent, and I think we're going to see more and more of that going forward.
So
hang on, Chris. I just got to ask you something there, because I've got teenagers at home, and we tried to talk to them about things like privacy, and they were saying, "So what? So what if someone has my credentials? Who am I?" You know, somebody, and you watch the Social Dilemma, and you watch the various series that are out there that talk about how our data is farmed and owned and that type of thing, and their responses, and actually most of my or even some of my IT literate friends would go, shoulder shrug, so what? How am I possibly impacted with my information that I give out freely for the exchange of free services? Or somebody hacks my email address, I change my password. Who cares?
Well, they should care. So something that's increased here in the U.S. too is fraudulent unemployment benefits. For one, that's one example where you don't necessarily need someone's online banking, information. But what you do need is you need some basic information to be able to file unemployment, benefits on their behalf. And so since COVID happened, and there was, a lot of, people that have lost their jobs and companies that downsized, that's been a big fraudulent activity. And all you need is a certain amount of data on a specific user to go file unemployment benefits on their behalf. So the criminals are always going to find a way, to try to scam you out of something. And in kids' case, they're on online gaming communities. There may be some, rewards points that they use in a, specific gaming genre that they're playing. That's a valuable asset to the bad guys.
Hey, I mean, if you're an online predator preying on young children, that could be a valuable asset to you too, right?
Yeah.
But the something that kind of I think has something I've been thinking about over the last few days because of some other conversations I'm having with some other folks is the user community within companies, right? And so you made the point, Nick, like teenagers, a lot of people just don't kind of understand the problem here. But if you think about organizations, when do you typically talk to your users as a business, right? You might talk to them if you're making some sort of change or there's an outage, or do you know what I mean? But it's not for a lot of organizations, it's not a continuous thing of like, hey guys, threats and threat actors are continuing to get smarter, right? But organizations are not bringing the user community on this journey of, because at this point in time, you can't just rely on the security team to keep everyone in the organization safe. Sure, these are the guys, these are the folks who need to make the decisions around policy and product and all of that. But I think that every user these days, every employee within an organization has some form of responsibility to keep that organization's data safe, right? And if a lot of organizations I don't think necessarily would communicate it in that way, but I think personally that you need to bring your team, your employees on this journey with you as an organization. So continuous education, and by that I don't mean blasting them with a weekly email that is 17 pages long, because we all know no one's going to read that, right? Or what I've seen a lot of companies do, which I always laugh at this, is they'll do like phishing campaigns, like test campaigns. There are some products in the market that you can use to do that. But instead of being constructive with the feedback on these things, they will name and shame people or departments who click links, right? To me, that's not a way to educate your workforce. If you were to take an approach like that, and maybe some other lunch and learn or some other approaches, and you bundle this up and you come up with like a employee education program around cybersecurity, I suspect for a lot of organizations that investment will be repaid, multiple times over, because of saved saved whatever, saved downtime, saved revenue, saved everything, reputation. And I wonder why this is so difficult to get this message out, right? And this is the thing that I've been thinking about. I'm working on a blog post at the moment about this, and it's been in my mind. And when I was talking to Donovan about account takeover, kind of the two of those things just collided for me, and I kind of went, well, hang on, like there's this challenge here with folks don't always understand the problem with reusing passwords, or why some of these things are, and no one takes the time to actually sit them down and go, hey, here's why we can't do that. If you do this thing, it's going to result in that thing, which is going to result in that thing, and it's going to cause this, right? And when you can break it down to someone like that, they're a lot more likely to go, I understand that now, instead of saying, well, if you click that link, we're going to fire your ass. Like, we can't work with people. This is not the 60s, right? You can't treat folks like that anymore.
Yeah, you bring up something interesting, Chris, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wanna talk about this real quick too. Is not just the reuse of passwords. People they'll make slight changes to a password and think that that's okay. Maybe add a special character, exclamation point, maybe add a couple of zeros. And one of the things we do is we look for, we call it fuzzy matches. So we'll do a scan on a password and say, show me fuzzy matches for this password. And what you end up seeing is, 50 additional or 100 additional passwords that have that same string in it, but it's got a few added characters to it. But the criminals can figure that out too. So one of the tools that we have is a product called Active Directory Guardian. So it snaps into your AD tree, and it does exactly that. So if somebody changes a password, we'll do a fuzzy scan, fuzzy match, and see if there's other passwords that are similar to that password that has been seen in a breach. But yeah, that's exactly right. It's a fine line between creating proper security awareness in your user community, and not adding a lot of friction. That's what we deal with a lot. Is when we talk to customers that have large consumer base, they'll be like, well, we don't want to create any friction. We don't want to force people to constantly change their passwords, or we want them to log in and use our product or our application. So there's some people that are willing to take some risk, but I think this is going to become more and more prevalent. I think what happened with SolarWinds last year was a great example of how sophisticated attacks have become. I read up a little. I was really interested in how these guys girls were able to embed their code in legitimate code, and how they got away with it. And they were so crafty. They, early on in the reconnaissance process, they created empty classes just to see if somebody would notice. So no code yet, just empty classes in the code, and nobody picked up on it. So which just is a whole different discussion around code reviews and stuff like that. And I think that's going to become more. It's a bigger visibility now to development teams. But I think sophisticated attacks like that is not going to go away. It's going to become more prevalent. And identity-centric attacks is the way that attackers are trying to come into environments. They're not creating zero-day malware anymore. It's too much work. If they have legitimate usernames and passwords to get into accounts, I think that's what the bad guys prefer. So
you make an interesting point about the code review stuff, right? And I think that, and this is definitely a rabbit hole for another episode.
Yeah.
But for the longest time, I think developer teams have started to understand that we need to start reviewing our code, right? We need to get some sort of security process around making sure that the code we're shipping or committing is valid, especially today with stuff being, get committed to 100 cloud, Git repositories and all that stuff. But where I think this process breaks down still, or is a little bit more immature, is in the infrastructure teams who are writing script code, right? Because a lot of I'm an infra guy. I like to script stuff. I don't see myself as a developer. But yet, when you look at, the 200-line PowerShell script that I wrote to do this thing, that has the potential to cause a lot of damage if someone were to sneak in, a few things there, or if someone were to change some of those gets to sets, right? All of a sudden, now we're doing a little bit of damage in the environment. And so I think that organizations need to start thinking about these code review processes across, their infrastructure as code, across their DevOps teams, not just looking at the developers and going, well, you're writing that application and we want to make sure that the code's secure. But like I said, that's a rant for another episode. We need to just make a note of that, Nick. So what I wanted to ask you, fascinatingly or interestingly enough, is that we talked about Have I Been Pwned, and I think that's a fantastic resource that's freely available to folks. But you guys go a little step further because you actually crack the passwords in these breaches, don't you?
Yeah. So thanks for bringing that up. Our process essentially is, obviously step one, via our human intelligence, team community all over the world, personas that they manage, infiltrate these, underground communities, forums, dark web, chat rooms, whatever. And what happens is when a criminal breaks into an organization, the first thing they do is, because they get a huge dump, right? A raw file, huge, not parsed, not normalized. They'll typically reach out to their network of trusted, bad guys, basically, and say, hey, I've got this, dump. What do I do with it? It's hashed passwords, obviously. Everybody wants it in plain text, because that, becomes a lot more valuable. And at that point, they typically reach out to somebody, in our community. That's part of their community, to a persona or to a person, that manages a persona. And we'll say, yeah, let's give me the file. We'll take a look at it. And then that's essentially how we social engineer them out of the data. And then we put it through a process where we parse the data, deduplicate it, obviously, by parsing, distinguishing an IP address from a social security number or a phone number or a credit card number. And then we put it through a password, hacking process. And we have a team dedicated to, building that technology. And it took a long time, obviously. But we focus on cracking the passwords so that, when the data is curated, we have a plain text password, because that is what becomes valuable. And now we can, map that to a hash, and we can, plug that into Active Directory. And so when people are logging into an environment with credentials that's been seen in a breach, we can alert that user, we can alert the organization. We have tools built around protecting, people. But yeah, that's the process essentially. That we go through when we ingest a new breach, and we ingest breaches every week, once a week. There's an email that goes out that says, we've ingested X amount of breaches, and it gets uploaded into our breach catalog. And like I said, we have over 31,000 breaches, and now we're starting to see a lot of this botnet data. So now we can see where the malware is. We actually show you on the C drive where the malware is on that endpoint. Mm-hmm. And then the target URLs, where these people that are infected with the botnet data is going to. And I'll just quickly mention this again, because we talked about development teams and development community. And not to, say these guys don't care about security, but I'd say they are more focused maybe on developing the functionality of whatever they're working on than focusing on security, right? Traditionally, development teams they spin up environments quickly, GitHub repositories. So a lot of times when I find, and it's easy to spot a developer, but I can see the target URLs that they're going to, which is Jira in the name, or GitHub, or Jenkins, or Puppet, or so I know that person is probably a developer because the tools or the name in the server name that he's going to, I can see that person is a developer. And oftentimes in these Git repositories, they upload user data, right? Because they're testing some piece of functionality, and they'll have at least maybe a sample of user data that they're uploading because they're testing some kind of functionality that they're building. And that's where the bad guys get a lot of the data too. Git repositories that are not secure enough. That's what happened to SolarWinds too. Similar thing that happened to them. So yeah, absolutely. That's a discussion, like we said, for another
So I have a quick story on Git repositories. A couple of years ago, I was in Amsterdam doing speaking at a conference, and I had this really elaborate PowerShell automation demo that I had kind of come up with, and the basically it was a PowerShell script being kicked off by a form in Microsoft Forms, right? And it would go off and connect to a tenant and do a whole bunch of stuff, and then it would email report, and it would also make a phone call to the person who was kicking the script off to tell them that things were done. And I used Twilio, the Twilio API, to do the phone call piece. And I was working, I still remember this because I was sitting in the speaker room, making some last minute changes to the script, and I hit commit to commit it to my GitHub repository, and I didn't take out my API key for the API. And within like 30 seconds, I had an email from Twilio in my inbox saying, "We found your API key in a GitHub repository. We have nuked it," basically. And so I had to go generate a new key to make all this stuff work. But it was incredible to me that they, in the greater scheme of Twilio's business, my however many dollars a month I spend with them is minimal, right? And yet they still have the security processes in place to go, "Hey, we're protecting you from yourself, buddy." So that was awesome. That's what you just said just reminded me of that. But so what I wanted to ask, I guess we're coming up towards the end of the show here, and we've been talking about all of the bad, yeah, right? And if for those folks listening, I guess everyone's sitting there going, "Well, okay, you've told me how bad this is, but you haven't told me why I need to care about this yet, or what I can do to kind of help." Right? Now, I think, as with all this stuff, there are some basic things that you can do to help reduce the risk. Right? Number one, multi-factor authentication. I think that's like the new tagline for this show is, "Have you enabled MFA yet?" And I might have to make some t-shirts or something like that. But multi-factor authentication is it isn't the be all and end all, but certainly is going to help in a very large majority of these types of instances, because it doesn't matter if the attacker has your password, they can't necessarily do something with it, right? But then I also think that user education, as we touched on, and that sort of awareness training is really important. And as an organization today, in 2021, you should or have to have some form of cybersecurity awareness program within your business, right? Obviously, the very large organizations that have ridiculous compliance and regulatory requirements already have something like this. And chances are it was built in the 90s and it has really old school video CPTs or something, right? But I think that any organization today should have and can massively benefit from some form of cyber awareness training program that isn't just when the user joins the company, you have to go through this video thing. It's an ongoing process that evolves as the threats evolve. I think that is, and I realize it's a big ask, but I think that it's very, very beneficial for organizations. But then also, when we think about the endpoint side of this, right? Get your endpoints in order, folks. Like there is no excuse to have a botnet persisting on an endpoint in today's world, right? It doesn't have to be a Microsoft product. There are tons of products out there, but keeping stuff up to date it's so important. And I always have a chuckle / cry to myself when I have conversations with customers and they give me a hard time about security, right? You can't have access to that because we're not going to compromise our security. Okay, I understand that. And then come to find you haven't patched your Exchange server in 5 years, or you know what I mean. There's a Windows 2003 server floating around in your network. Well, if you're going to be security conscious and you're going to be that pedantic about being secure, it goes across everything. You can't just be secure on the identity and forget about the endpoint, is the point I'm trying to make here.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. You guys brought all this up. You talked about Teams earlier, MFA. I was, found a site recently, a SharePoint site that had, for a very large company that had no MFA in place. And it was, really sensitive, HR stuff. So I still see that all the time too. What's funny to me is sometimes when we talk to a CISO or the CISO community, and they'll say, well, our budget for security is, really limited. And I'm like, really? Is that the right approach to take for an organization to, be stingy on security budget? Maybe we need to, shift the way, we allocate budget because, where our lives are online. Everything is online. Everything we do is online. When was the last time you went to a bank, physically to a bank? Everything happens online.
And just think about the world we live in today, right? So, a year ago, so many companies had to do this like reactive scramble to the cloud just to keep productivity going.
Yeah.
Like if they wanted to keep the doors open, they had to go online and they had to go to the cloud. And so we saw, remember last year, we saw that like Teams usage just skyrocketed, right? But we're in a place now where this is almost like the new normal, and the risk of getting it wrong. If imagine you're the person who controls the logistics and the transport for a COVID vaccine, and you've left your logistics password, or your machine is infected with some botnet, and now someone can reroute the trucks that you know what I mean? Like you can come up with these scenarios and they may seem really far-fetched, but are they really that far-fetched? Like, is it really that far-fetched to think that someone would be able to mess with something? I mean, if you remember, Nick, we talked to Anthony Bartolo at Ignite a couple of years ago about his customer in Canada who had their refrigeration system hacked through the phone line. Remember that?
Yeah.
I mean, this is but again, like, think about the vaccine. That stuff has to be, I assume, I'm not, I have no medical training. I assume that stuff has to be refrigerated or at least kept at some sort of consistent temperature. Everything's online these days, including refrigeration systems, right?
Yes.
The consequences of these little actions can be quite catastrophic. So those basic things, I think, start with multi-factor. If you don't already have it enabled for every account, it's important. Microsoft is a legit security vendor. Don't be scared, right? And then the endpoint, there's again no excuse with the endpoint. Keep those endpoints up to date. I think that's a very, very valuable takeaway. And the botnet situation, really scares me because it can happen so easily, right?
Yeah, I agree. And Chris, I'll just throw a little plug in for ATO at the end here is you hit on all the things that are really critical for a security program. And then, having awareness on the credentials that your consumers or your employees are using. Has it been seen in a breach before? Prompt that user to change their password, do a scan, see if there's fuzzy matches for that password. So at least you make it harder for the criminal, to get into your environment. I'd say all of the things you guys mentioned and having that, ATO visibility in your environment is going to give you so much more protection.
So that actually brings up, sorry, Nick, did you have some closing thoughts?
No, not at all. I wanted to ask Donovan where he wanted to be found, but we'll do that after your thought.
No, that was my thought. Yeah,
so Donovan, go on.
I was going to say, typically, we would sort of give you the opportunity to just, plug yourself. If you want to be found on any social media platforms or data breaches, or if someone's interested in, I guess, getting in touch with you and what you guys are doing at SpyCloud, you guys and gals at SpyCloud are doing, how can folks reach out to you?
Yeah, thanks, guys. So I'm on LinkedIn, Donovan Stevens, Donovan, Stevens with a V. My SpyCloud email address is donovan.stevens@spycloud.com. So folks can, shoot me an email, connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to, continue having a conversation about account takeover activity, or even just checking, if you want to check what your exposure is, your domain, your company domain, your email address. I'm happy to, run a quick search and, let you know how many records we found, in our breach data, and we can go from there. Yeah, but thank you very much. I really enjoyed our conversation. Nick, I'd love to connect with you sometime and maybe show you some of the stuff that I showed Chris too. I think, Microsoft is obviously a great partner for us because of our integration with Active Directory. I think, we snap into AD so seamlessly. It's just a, great benefit to anybody that uses Active Directory too.
Sweet, yeah. And so we've got a huge rabbit hole here. So I think we've got enough for another show, and I think we might want to do a part 2 on this.
Yeah, we can bring Warren in. Warren, we miss you, buddy.
Yeah, Warren, come back.
Yeah, and on the second show, maybe I'll show you guys some of this investigation stuff that we do. It's really interesting.
We can investigate Warren. What could go wrong, right?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Donovan, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, guys. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks, Chris.